This week we're going to be talking about some applications of deep learning. So let's just start by recapping what we already know about what deep learning is. So essentially, deep learning is any kind of machine learning application that makes use of neural networks with multiple hidden layers. These layers typically perform weighted sum operations, just linear transformations, followed by a non-linear activation function of some kind. Without this kind of nonlinearity, the depth is essentially meaningless in a neural network, and all of the concatenated linear operations can essentially be boiled down into a single transformation. The layers in a deep neural network learn increasingly complex feature representations or decision functions based on combinations of previously learned feature representations or decisions from previous layers. As you get further layers down the stack, you can get extremely arbitrarily complex functions generated. Each of the patterns of activations from layers within the network can be considered as a learned representation, a projection of the data from the input into a different basis. The simplest variety of deep learning network is the multi-layer perceptron, in which all of the layers are fully connected and they all feed only forwards. We also looked at a couple of other kinds of neural network. Convolutional networks, or convolutional layers within deep neural networks, impose a kind of local spatiotemporal structure on the inputs. They expect particular kinds of relationships between locally connected neurons. These kinds of networks use convolutional filters, which are learned, and they're applied with the same filter weights at every location in the input data. This imposes an inductive bias, which we term translational equivariance. The same kind of pattern at a different location in the data will produce the same kind of response, but also translated in the same way. The other kind of network that we had a look at was a recurrent neural network. This is no longer purely feed-forward, but some information is passed from one invocation of the network on a piece of data to the next. This is particularly relevant for processing sequences of data where the order of presentation of the tokens is important. The recurrent layers or recurrent networks maintain some kind of hidden state that evolves over time. The layers in a neural network work mostly in a self-contained, kind of encapsulated black box fashion, where they're only really concerned with their immediate inputs and outputs, and they know how to handle all of those. And these can be plugged together like building blocks into complex network architectures. Other types of layers and connectivity patterns are possible, and we will touch on some of those this week. Learning in neural networks, especially deep neural networks, depends on being able to calculate the gradients of a loss function with respect to all of the individual weights and parameters in the network. And there might be a very large number of these parameters. This process of calculating gradients is made possible by backpropagation, which is a form of automated differentiation, which functions by applying the chain rule of differentiation recursively back through the layers of the network. Backpropagation operates in two phases. There's a forward pass where input data is propagated forward through the network all the way to the end, and there's a backward pass where the gradients calculated at the end are back propagated through the network, with each node in the network, each layer or neuron calculating its own gradients with respect to its immediate outputs and inputs. Once gradients are calculated, learning occurs by updating the parameters using some variation of stochastic gradient descent. All models learn from a finite number of discrete training samples. For generalization, we would like the internal representations, the learned spaces of the networks, to be to some extent locally smooth, so that data samples that are in some unspecified way similar are projected to locations which are in some way connected in the feature spaces that are close together or similarly related. There are a variety of ways of trying to improve the smoothness of the learned representations. We can just employ more training data, so we more densely sample the space of the inputs, and that will help us to delineate the problem space within the internal layers. We can use data augmentation methods, perturbing our inputs to both increase the number of samples that we're testing on and also to increase the smoothness by replacing a single sample to a single point projection with a cloud of fuzzy samples which are all closely related but perturbed from one another, which we hope will project to a similar fuzzy region in our feature space. Various regularization methods can also be seen as attempts to encourage smoothness in the internal representations, to avoid overfitting an internal representation that is too spiky and jaggy and dependent on too many minor trivial details of the input data. All of these can be viewed as ad hoc methods of imposing some kind of distributional assumptions on the distribution of features within the learned spaces. We also, in the context of unsupervised learning models, such as Gaussian mixture models and hidden Markov models, have imposed some kinds of distributional assumptions explicitly. So far, in talking about neural networks, we have mostly considered only supervised learning problems where the target space is defined by labels. For these kinds of problems, it is possible, and this is not just in connection with neural networks, but with machine learning models in general, to approach the problem in two distinct kinds of ways. These are known as generative models versus discriminative models. Discriminative models, which are basically the only kind we've really looked at for most of the module, learn the conditional distribution of the output labels given the input features. So they learn P of Y given X. In generative modeling approaches, by contrast, the algorithm model attempts to learn the input distribution and the joint distribution of the inputs and the labels. So in this case, the learned distribution would be the distribution of X and Y, and this would usually be decomposed as the probability of X given Y multiplied by the probability of Y. So this is a dichotomy that doesn't always hold, and not all models fall neatly within it, but it can sometimes be a useful way of thinking about things. And although we haven't explicitly dealt with generative models in a supervised setting, there have been cases in the lab exercises where you have been required to produce a model from which you can generate data. And in those cases, you would have been explicitly modeling the distribution of the inputs and outputs. However, those were not learned models, they were specified a priori. When we are dealing with unsupervised problems, when we don't have labels Y, then we are always basically modeling the input distribution. And so these models are essentially always in the generative mode. This is true for the unsupervised methods that we looked at in the last couple of weeks for Gaussian mixture models, hidden Markov models, even for things like PCA and clustering. We did touch on this also back in week 6 in the context of neural networks for representation learning and word embeddings. This week we'll be looking at some further examples where deep neural networks provide the plumbing, the infrastructure for generative learning from unlabeled or mostly unlabeled data.